Deep in the turquoise waters of the Sulu Sea, there is a community of people known as the Bajau. They are often called sea nomads, individuals who spend 60% of their daily lives underwater, hunting at depths of over 70 meters on a single breath. To a normal human, this is a physiological impossibility. Your lungs would collapse and your brain would starve of oxygen. But the Bajau are not normal humans. Evolution has carved their DNA into something else entirely, granting them spleens 50% larger than the average person, acting as a biological scuba tank that injects oxygenated red blood cells into their circulation during a dive. We often think of the human genome as a finished book, a static blueprint printed during the dawn of our species in Africa. We are taught that we are 99.9% identical. But if you look at the 7,641 islands that make up the Philippine archipelago, that narrative begins to fracture. Here, the genetic code isn't just a record of ancestry. It is a chaotic, beautiful, and violent collision of worlds. In the rugged highlands of Luzon, you will find the Ayta Magbukun, a group of people who possess the highest level of Denisovan ancestry in the entire world, carrying the genetic ghosts of a mysterious human cousin that went extinct everywhere else tens of thousands of years ago. Why does this matter? Because the Philippines is not just a country, it is a genetic laboratory. It is the place where the most distant branches of the human family tree finally met and tangled. To understand Filipino DNA is to realize that the human blueprint we were promised by the Human Genome Project in the 1990s was a drastic oversimplification. We were told that by now, we would all have genome cards, swiping our DNA at a doctor's office to find the single mutation responsible for our ailments. But as we zoom in from the macro scale of the Bajau's superhuman diving to the micro scale of their nucleotides, we find that the truth is far more mysterious. The link between our DNA and who we are is not a straight line. It is a shifting landscape. For decades, we relied on the Mendelian view of genetics, the idea that traits are passed down like clean binary packages. Gregor Mendel, the 19th century friar, gave us the Punnett square, suggesting that if you have the gene for a trait, that trait will manifest. Yellow peas or green peas, brown eyes or glue eyes. It was elegant, it was mathematical, and as it turns out, it was almost entirely wrong when applied to the complexity of human migration. If you were to apply a Punnett square to the population of the Philippines, the math would break. The Filipino genome is a polyextant marvel. It contains the signatures of ancient ghost populations, the seafaring Austronesians who mastered the Pacific, the colonial imprints of Spain and Mexico, and the trade-driven infusions of Chinese and South Asian lineages. But this isn't just a story of mixing. It is a story of how environment and isolation can force the genetic marble, as biologist Conrad Waddington would call it, to roll down entirely new valleys. Think of the genome not as a fixed blueprint, but as a circus tent held up by thousands of pegs and guy ropes. These pegs are your genes. The surface of the tent is your potential. In the Philippines, the tensions on these ropes, the environment, the geography, and the sheer isolation of the islands have pulled the tent into shapes seen nowhere else on Earth. We are finding that the rules of genetics we learned in high school were based on purified lineages, artificial cases where scientists deliberately ignored the messiness of reality. But the reality of the Filipino people is nothing if not messy. It is a biological paradox, a population that is simultaneously a gateway to our ancient past and a window into the future of human adaptation. But this discovery of super-adaptation and ancient ghost DNA revealed a hidden cost, one that challenges everything we thought we knew about the standard human model. To understand why the Philippines holds this title of most unique, we have to move beyond the surface-level maps and look at the deep time mechanics of the Earth itself. For much of the Pleistocene epoch, as ice sheets swallowed the northern hemispheres, sea levels plummeted, exposing a massive subcontinental shelf known as Sundaland. This was a terrestrial bridge that connected what we now know as Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia into a single contiguous landmass. But the Philippines was different. It remained, for the most part, an oceanic archipelago, separated from the mainland by deep water trenches. This moat acted as a biological filter. It meant that whatever reached these islands stayed there, evolving in a pressure cooker of isolation. This is the macro setting for a micro-revolution. When the first modern humans arrived in the Philippines at least 67,000 years ago, evidenced by the discovery of Homo luzonensis in Calao Cave, they weren't entering an empty house. They were walking into an evolutionary theater where different hominin species had already been pulling the guy ropes of the genetic landscape for millennia. When we look at the DNA of the modern Filipino, we aren't just looking at a mix of ethnicities. We are looking at a genetic palimpsest, a parchment that has been written on, erased, and rewritten over and over again. In 2021, a landmark study published in Cell analyzed 2.3 million genotypes from 115 indigenous groups in the Philippines. The results sent shockwaves through the halls of Harvard and the Max Planck Institute. The Ayta Magbukun were found to possess roughly 5% Denisovan ancestry. To put that in perspective, that is roughly 30 to 40% more Denisovan DNA than that found in the Highlanders of Papua New Guinea or Aboriginal Australians, who were previously thought to be the record holders.
This brings us back to the Waddington landscape. If the Denisovans are a peg in the genetic tent, their influence in the Philippines is pulling the fabric into a unique peak. This isn't just a fun fact for anthropologists, it has radical implications for biology. These Denisovan sequences aren't junk DNA. They are often found in regions of the genome linked to the immune system and skin structure. The ancient ancestors of Filipinos essentially stole the survival kit of a species that had already spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to the tropical environment. They bypassed the slow crawl of natural selection by breeding with the locals. But there is a flaw in how we perceive this. We have a tendency to view pure DNA as the gold standard, a leftover habit from the Mendelian era. We want to believe there is a pure Filipino, a pure Spaniard, or a pure Chinese lineage. But the helix horizon of the Filipino genome proves that purity is a biological myth. Every time a new group arrived, be it the Austronesian seafaring farmers 4,000 years ago, or the Indianized traders of the 9th century, the marble of development didn't just stay in its old bin, it found new paths. The Austronesian expansion is perhaps the most impressive maritime feat in human history. These people didn't just stumble upon the Philippines, they settled it with a sophisticated toolkit of crops, livestock, and navigation. Their DNA is the base layer for the majority of the modern population, providing the genetic scaffolding for the famous Filipino resilience. But even this layer is not uniform. The rugged topography of the islands, from the Cordillera Mountains to the marshlands of Mindanao, meant that groups only a few dozen miles apart were genetically drifting away from each other for thousands of years. This created what scientists call extreme genetic differentiation. In most parts of the world, populations living close to each other look genetically similar. In the Philippines, you can find two groups on the same island who are genetically as distinct from each other as a European is from an East Asian. This level of diversity within a single nation is unparalleled. It turns the entire country into a microcosm of the human experience. But this diversity is not a quiet archive of the past. It is an active, churning engine of the present. As these ancient lineages began to collide with the colonial era, the genetic landscape didn't just shift, it underwent a seismic upheaval. The arrival of the Spanish galleons from Acapulco brought not just silk and spices,
but a massive infusion of Latin American and European alleles. But this collision of worlds revealed a hidden cost, one that would change the very way we define health and disease for millions of people. When we examine the colonial era of the Philippines, we often focus on the architecture of Intramuros or the spread of Catholicism, but the biological reality was happening at the level of the blood. The Manila Galleon trade route, which operated for 250 years, didn't just move silver, it moved people. Unlike the British or Dutch colonies, the Spanish Philippines was governed through Mexico, the viceroyalty of New Spain. This created a unique trans-Pacific genetic bridge. Recent genomic studies have detected significant traces of Native American DNA across the Philippine population, specifically from groups in what is now central Mexico. This wasn't a simple 3-to-1 ratio like Mendel's peas. This was the sudden introduction of thousands of years of separate evolutionary history into a single gene pool. When a Native American peg and a Spanish peg were hammered into the Filipino genetic tent, the guy ropes didn't just tighten, they vibrated with new tensions. This is where the blueprint model of the Human Genome Project fails us. If DNA were a simple blueprint, we could predict exactly what these new combinations would produce. But the Filipino genome behaves more like a complex adaptive system. Take, for instance, the way Filipinos process sugar and fat. The thrifty gene hypothesis suggests that indigenous populations who survived cycles of feast and famine developed genes that are exceptionally efficient at storing energy. In the isolation of the Philippines, these genes were a masterpiece of survival. But when you introduce the modern Western diet, a byproduct of that same colonial exchange, the marble on the Waddington landscape is pushed by a powerful environmental hairdryer. The result? The Philippines has some of the highest rates of metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes in Southeast Asia. The very genes that ensured their ancestors' survival in the rainforests and on the high seas are now, in a different environment, a liability. This is the mismatch theory in action. It proves that there is no such thing as a bad gene, only a gene in the wrong environment. To call a gene pathogenic is to ignore the landscape it sits on. This brings us to a startling realization about Filipino uniqueness. Their DNA is perhaps the most stress-tested on the planet. From the volcanic eruptions of Mount Pinatubo to the relentless path of Pacific typhoons, the Filipino population has been subjected to extreme selective pressures for millennia. This has resulted in what scientists call positive selection in the immune system. Filipino DNA shows a remarkable diversity in the HLA, or human leukocyte antigen complex, the part of our genome that helps the immune system recognize self from non-self. Because the Philippines was a crossroads of trade for centuries, their people were exposed to a dizzying array of pathogens from India, China, Arabia, and Europe. Those who survived had the most robust, flexible immune systems. Today, this makes Filipino DNA a goldmine for immunology research. They carry ancient resistance to diseases that are still baffling modern medicine.
But as we peel back the layers of this genetic masterpiece, we find something even more provocative. We find that the Filipino identity isn't just a mix of what came from the outside, it is defined by what stayed hidden. In the mountains of the Visayas, there are groups whose genetic markers are so distinct they don't match any known migration pattern. They are the relict populations, survivors of an even older world that we are only just beginning to map. However, the deeper we look into these relict sequences, the more we realize that the traditional tree of life model is insufficient. The Filipino genome isn't a branch, it's a web. And it's a web that is currently being threatened by the very technology that discovered it. But this scientific gold rush to map the Filipino genome has a dark side, a reality that echoes the exploitative history of the islands themselves. The scientific gold rush to sequence Filipino DNA
has ignited a complex debate over genetic sovereignty. For decades, Western researchers looked at the unique adaptations of the Philippines as a resource to be mined, much like the gold and copper of the Benguet Mountains. This is where the macro story of national identity meets the micro reality of patenting life. When scientists discovered the unique anti-thirst and anti-starvation markers in certain indigenous Filipino groups, there was an immediate rush to understand how these could be commercialized into treatments for the global obesity crisis. This creates a profound ethical information gap. Who owns the rights to a mutation that evolved over 50,000 years in a secluded valley? If a pharmaceutical company develops a drug based on the Denisovan heritage of the Ayta Magbukun, do the Ayta see any of that wealth? In the current landscape of global genetics, the answer is often no. This is the modern version of the colonial Galleon, extracting a rare and valuable resource from the islands and shipping it across the ocean to be refined and sold back to the world. But the Filipino response to this has been equally unique. The Philippines is one of the few nations in the Southeast Asian region to develop its own robust genomic research infrastructure, such as the Philippine Genome Center. They are moving away from being the subjects of research to being the authors of it. They are using DNA to prove land rights, using ancestral markers to show that indigenous groups have been the stewards of specific territories long before the concept of private property even arrived. DNA here isn't just biology, it's a legal deed to the earth itself. This brings us to the most startling discovery of all, the Negrito lineages. For a long time, the term Negrito was used by outsiders to group together different short-statured, dark-skinned peoples across Asia. But DNA analysis has proven that this is a phenotypic illusion. Genetically, the Negritos of the Philippines are more different than the Negritos of the Andaman Islands or the Malay Peninsula than a Norwegian is from an Italian. They represent multiple independent arrivals into the archipelago. They are living evidence of convergent evolution, where the environment of the tropical rainforest is so specific and so demanding that it forced different groups of humans to evolve similar physical traits entirely by coincidence. It is the Waddington landscape at its most aggressive. The environment didn't just nudge the marble, it carved a deep, inevitable trench. This leads us to a paradigm shift in how we view the Filipino people. They are not a homogenized race. They are a collection of evolutionary experiments happening simultaneously on 7,000 different islands. While the rest of the world was becoming more genetically similar through land-based empires and silk roads, the Philippines was a splintering mirror, reflecting dozens of different versions of what it means to be human. The diversity is so high that if you took two random people from different provinces in the Philippines, their genetic distance could be greater than the distance between a person from England and a person from India. This is why one-size-fits-all medicine is a failure in this region. A drug dosage that works for a Tagalog in Manila might be ineffective or even toxic for a Lumad in Mindanao. The Filipino genome is the ultimate argument for precision medicine, a future where your treatment is tailored to the specific pegs and guy ropes of your ancestral tent. But this diversity carries a hidden risk, one that scientists are only now beginning to quantify as the climate of the planet begins to shift once again. The risk lies in the specialization trap. In biology, the more perfectly an organism adapts to a specific niche, the more vulnerable it becomes when that niche disappears. The Bajau's enlarged spleens and the Ayta's Denisovan-derived immune systems are masterpieces of local engineering, but they were forged in a world of stable coastlines and ancient forests. Today, as rising sea levels threaten to submerge the very islands that acted as evolutionary incubators, the Filipino genome is facing its greatest test since the end of the last ice age. We are witnessing a genetic erasure. As rural populations migrate to megacities like Manila and Cebu, The extreme genetic differentiation that took 50,000 years to create is being blurred in the single generation. This is the panmixia effect, the blending of all the distinct valleys of the Waddington landscape into one giant flat plain. While this social integration is a triumph of national unity, it is a loss of biological data. Every time a remote language dies or a tribe is displaced, a unique configuration of the human tent is folded up and tucked away forever.
Yet, there is a defiant resilience encoded in the Filipino spirit that mirrors their DNA. Scientists are finding that the mixing itself is a form of biological insurance. By bringing together the seafaring genes of the Austronesians, the highland adaptations of the Negritos, and the varied immune responses of global traders, the modern Filipino has created a hybrid vigor. They have become one of the most genetically flexible populations on the planet. They are the generalists of the future, equipped with a toolkit harvested from every corner of the human experience. If the Human Genome Project taught us that we have a blueprint, the Philippines has taught us that the blueprint is written in disappearing ink, constantly being revised by the sea, the mountains, and the strangers who wash up on the shore. To be Filipino is to carry a piece of the Denisovan past, a piece of the Austronesian expansion, and a piece of the colonial future all at once. It is a reminder that we are not finished products of evolution. We are works in progress. The unique nature of Filipino DNA isn't just about being different, it's about being inclusive. It is the only place on Earth where the most ancient lineages of humanity have successfully integrated with the most modern, creating a biological bridge that spans the entire history of our species. As we look toward a future of global migration and climate instability, the Filipino genome may provide the strategy of the genes that the rest of the world will eventually need to survive. But the story of human adaptation doesn't end in the islands of Southeast Asia. To truly understand how our DNA shapes our destiny, we have to look at the other side of the world, where another group of humans took a completely different path to biological greatness. If you've ever wondered why some people can survive in the thinnest air on Earth while others gasp for breath, you need to see how the people of the Tibetan Plateau hacked their own genetics to live where no human should. A journey that leads us to the highest peaks and even deeper into the mystery of our extinct cousins.